Well, hello everybody, and welcome to my show. My name is Jason DaCosta. Just to give you a little bit of a heads up, I am about to embark on a mini-series, very short mini-series. As of right now, it's about three parts long, and the mini-series centers around the fullness of the Gentiles passage. And what I'm going to do, and what I've already done, actually two of them were already recorded. It's kind of weird how I record. Sometimes I'll pre-record, then share. Sometimes I'll pre-record, then come back like I am today and record something and either append it or put it on the beginning of a already pre-recorded recording. Kind of weird. Don't try to understand it. It's just my methods of madness. But I wanted to just do this little addition to the beginning of my already pre-recorded audio and put it on here and just kind of, because I had recorded a couple of them. And then I said to myself, gee, you know what? This would make a nice little mini-series on the fullness of the Gentiles, Romans 11 passage, and just kind of linking it to certain places and showing how it's all about Israel. And so that's what I've decided to do, which is why I'm adding this to the beginning. So in a moment, you'll hear it kind of restart. You'll hear my intro again. I'll welcome you to the show again, and that's because that portion was already pre-recorded. But I wanted to add this. And also, I wanted to give a shout out again to Ryan McKittrick from All Prophecy Fulfilled. He did a pretty hilarious, actually, kind of plug video for myself and also for David King. And he shared it, I think it was Saturday night. So thanks, dude. That was pretty cool. I laughed my ass off, especially when he was doing the beginning where he had the mysterious music playing and he was saying that we were the two witnesses of Revelation 11. It's pretty funny stuff. So if you haven't seen it, or if you haven't subscribed to Ryan's channel, please do so. It's loaded with good content, good Israel-only content. And again, his channel is All Prophecy Fulfilled on YouTube. So that's about it, folks. I hope you enjoy this little mini-series. As of right now, it's going to be 3 parts long. I may end up expanding that and just tying in other passages. That way there's sort of like maybe a little, just a little mini-series that you can share with people. And not your typical passages to prove Romans 11. Like we all have our typical passages as IOers that we use to pretty much prove Romans 11 without any doubt. And how that was about Israel being called back from the nations. But I wanted to kind of prove it using passages that we don't use very often, right? And say, because that's the thing with Israel only, it's like, okay, people would argue, yeah, they have their 500 proof texts, right? And that's kind of sarcasm, because anytime you have 500 of anything, there's a good chance that it's true. And IO has at least that, probably much more. But they'd say, well, yeah, they have their proof text, but they don't have anything else beyond that, right? But that's nonsense. I set out to show that literally every passage, every portion, every chapter, every verse, every book in the New Testament, not even looking at the Old Testament, which is obviously 100% Israel anyway, but everything in the New Testament actually proves IO to be true. It just takes a little bit of working the text to get the meaning to squeeze out of it, right? And again, we're not catching all the nuances and all the little details that we probably need to have in our pocket in order to properly understand these things. So it takes time, it takes a little work, it takes a little bit of comparing and contrasting to other passages and a little bit of thought. But as you'll see here, so far I've produced 3 sections in this mini-series, and I've connected 3 portions that you typically don't see an IO or use to prove Romans 11 is about Israel and the nations coming back. And this first portion here is going to come from 2 Corinthians chapter 3. The second part of the series is going to come from John chapter 10, I believe it is. And then the third part of the mini-series is going to come from 2 Peter. I think it's chapter 4. Could be wrong. I got to look at it. I'm driving, so I don't really know it off the top of my head what chapter it is. But there's 3 portions of Scripture from 2 Corinthians 3, John chapter 10, and I believe 2 Peter 4 that I'm going to use to demonstrate exactly what Romans chapter 11 is saying. And like I said, I may actually expand that into other parts, but we'll see. It may only be 3 parts. But anyways, folks, that's all I got for the beginning. Like I said, this is going to start back up again here in a moment, and you're going to hear the intro again, and we'll get right into part 1. Thanks again, folks. Here we go.
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to my show. My name is Jason DaCosta, and this is Consistent Preterism. Thank you for joining me today. It's great to be here. It's great to have you. Today, what I want to do is I want to talk about the Romans 11 portion. Okay, and the Romans 11 portion is very important because it's a place of a lot of confusion. It is a place that many people wonder in Christianity what the heck it even means. It's a place where a lot of people cap off history in terms of the Christian view. In other words, when the fullness of the nations comes in, it all ends. It's a place that full preterists wrongly assume means something it doesn't. For instance, Don K. Preston thinks that the fullness of the Gentiles simply means the point in time when the Gentiles reached equal status as the Jews, which was really stupid because Paul was looking ahead to a time when the fullness of the nations would come in. And he had already said that there was no distinction between Jew and Gentile before that, or at that very time, there was no distinction. So Don's argument that this was speaking of a future time when the Gentile would have equal status as the Jew is just ridiculous. Pardon me. But there's been a lot of debate and a lot of arguments on this passage. And I don't think people really understand just how powerful this passage is for the Israel-only viewpoint. Excuse me. And I've done many, many audios on Romans 11. If you want a whole different array of teachings, you can go back on my channel and find many of them. But something triggered this recently. Last week I did a teaching on 2 Corinthians chapter 3. And 2 Corinthians chapter 3 is the place where I talked about how when the veil is lifted, or when one turns to the Lord, the veil is lifted, right? Let me do something real quick so that my phone doesn't keep going off here. I'll be right back. Okay, so anyways, I was talking about 2 Corinthians chapter 3, and something really dawned on me. And really, 2 Corinthians chapter 3, in that portion there, really kind of solidifies the IO interpretation and proves the IO interpretation without any doubt. And I'm going to show you how that is the case right now. I'm going to kind of tie the two portions together so that you can see. Okay, so first what we're going to do is we're going to read Romans 11, 25 and forward, and just kind of catch it in context. And I want you to take note of a few things here, okay? So Romans 11, verse 25, Paul says, "Lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers." He goes on, he says, "A partial hardening," or actually, in most translations it says blindness, okay? But blindness has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Okay, so now obviously we know the word Gentiles is kind of a tricky word. It seems like it would be better stated as just people out in the nations, or nations, okay? Those outside of Judaism. All right, so Paul is saying that blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the nations has come in. Okay, so what is he saying there? He's saying that Israel, collective Israel as a whole, has been blinded, but there was going to come a time where that blindness went away. Okay, that's why he uses the word until. And when would that blindness go away? Well, when the fullness of the nations came in. Okay, in other words, when all Israel was saved. Okay, because the fullness of the nations, those ones in the nations coming in, those ones in the nations being saved, those ones in the nations being marked out and sealed and brought back into the fold, would contribute to and would result in all Israel being saved. And it would end the blindness. right? When all of those ones in the nations came in, that blindness would go away. All right, so let's read it again. He says, blindness in part has come upon Israel until the fullness of the nations has come in, and in this way all Israel will be saved. Now, some of you may be saying, it doesn't say in this way. Well, yes, it does. Most translations word it as, and so all Israel will be saved. But if you actually look at the original Greek, it is actually supposed to say, the proper translation, and the English translation gets this right, and in this way all Israel will be saved. So in what way will all Israel be saved? When the fullness of the nations comes in. And why is that? Well, because the Israelites were in the nations. Okay? So when the fullness of the nations, in other words, when all the elect Israelites that were out there that needed salvation, when all of them came in, the result would be all Israel saved. Okay? So, pretty important to take note of there. Okay? In this way, all Israel will be saved. In other words, the verse 26 of Romans 11, all Israel saved, and in this way all Israel will be saved, is referring to something prior, something previously mentioned. And of course, it's the previous verse. The fullness of the nations coming in. That's what he answers when he says, and in this way all Israel will be saved. I trust you see what I'm saying. All Israel could not be saved until the fullness of the nations came in. Okay, that's very clear. But what I want you to take note of, so we can compare this to 2 Corinthians chapter 3, is the blindness. Okay, the blindness. Because Paul's talking here about blindness, is he not? And Paul's speaking of the Israelites being blinded. A partial blinding has come upon Israel until the fullness of the nations has come in. So there's this essence in this portion of Paul saying that individuals in the nations have to turn to the Lord. A mission is going out for these individuals, and they all have to come in. And in that way, all Israel's going to be saved. Right? But let's take a look. Remember the blindness now. Now remember, Romans 11 speaks of blindness upon Israel. Now let's go over to 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and let's try to tie this together. Now 2 Corinthians chapter 3 verse 7 and forward is all about the law. Okay, it starts off in verse 7. It says, "But if the ministry of death written and engraved on stones was glorious, so that the children of Israel could not look steadily at the face of Moses because of the glory of his countenance, which glory was passing away, how will the ministry of the Spirit not be more glorious?" Okay, so let's make a couple notes here. First of all, we're looking at the law. Paul's very clear that the ministry that was written and engraved on stones was called the ministry of death. That's simply because it brought condemnation and death to those who were under it. He goes on and he talks about Israel. He says, "If the ministry of death written and engraved on stones was glorious, so that the children of Israel could not look steadily at the face of Moses." Okay, so we know the subject here is the law. We know the people here are Israel. That's the focus. He goes on in verse 8. He says, "How will the ministry of the Spirit not be more glorious?" So he's comparing the Spirit to the law, the Spirit to the letter. Okay, but he goes on in verse 9. He says, "For if the ministry of condemnation had glory," that's the law. Then he goes on, he says, "the ministry of righteousness exceeds much more in glory." Okay, that's the Spirit. Old and new covenant. But look at what he says in verse 10. He says, "For even what was made glorious had no glory in this respect because of the glory that excels. For if what was passing away was glorious, what remains is much more glorious." Now here's where it gets interesting. Verse 12. This is key. Remember, we're still talking about the law, and we're still talking about Israel under that law. Nothing's changed here. There is no break in context. There is no break in thought. This is a flowing writing. Verse 12, it says, therefore, since we have such hope, we use great boldness of speech, unlike Moses, who put a veil over his face so that the children of Israel could not look steadily at the end of what was passing away. All right, so we're still talking about the law, we're still talking about Moses, and most importantly, we're still talking about the children of Israel. Okay, verse 14. But their minds were blinded. Okay, so let's read that again. Verse 13. Unlike Moses, who put a veil over his face so that the children of Israel could not look steadily at the end of what was passing away, but their minds were blinded. Okay. Now, whose minds are blinded here in context? Who is Paul speaking about being blinded? The children of Israel. Back with Moses. Okay? Very clear. The context is still the children of Israel. Now, let's continue. Verse 14, he says, but their minds were blinded. For until this day, the same veil remains unlifted in the reading of the Old Testament, because the veil is taken away in Christ. But even to this day, when Moses is read, a veil lies on their heart. Very, very important, okay? Because Paul is still speaking of Israel here, okay? He says Israel was blinded back in Moses' day. Likewise, the same thing exists today with the Israelites. He's basically saying Israel is blinded today. The same thing that he said in Romans 11 when he said a blindness in part has happened to Israel. Okay? So, again, let's read it in flowing context. Verse 14, but there, the Israelites' minds were blinded. For until this day, the same veil remains unlifted in the reading of the Old Testament, because the veil is taken away in Christ. But even to this day, when Moses is read, a veil lies on their heart, on the hearts of the Israelites. Nevertheless, when one turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Okay, verse 16 is so key. Verse 16 is what this all centers upon. Because Paul's whole focus here in this portion of 2 Corinthians chapter 3 is clearly on the children of Israel. Notice what he says. He says that they're blinded to this day. But notice what he says after that in verse 16. He says, nevertheless, when one of them, right, one of the Israelites, because that's the context here, but when one turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Okay, interesting. So, how does it all tie into Romans 11? Well, here's what you really have to realize, okay? This portion here, 2 Corinthians 3 verse 16 says, when one turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Well, the veil was the blindness, right? Okay? The veil was related to the being blind, the not being able to see. The lifting of the veil being removed, was the, doing away of that blindness. Okay? But Paul's whole focus here in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 is on the Israelites. It's not on pagans, it's not on Chinamen, it's not on Americans, it's not on Australians, it's on the Israelites. He says, to this day, the Israelites still remain blinded. But when one turns to the Lord, the blindness is taken away. Okay, let me repeat that. To this day, the Israelites remain blinded. But when one Israelite turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. That's precisely what 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 12 to 16 are saying. All right, now, if we go back to Romans 11, we can see something very interesting here. Romans 11 says, blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the nations has come in, and in this way all Israel will be saved. Okay, so here's the comparison. In 2 Corinthians chapter 3, it says, when one Israelite turns to the Lord. Okay? Well, that is precisely what Paul is saying here when he says when the fullness of the nations are coming in, resulting in all Israel saved. Let's see how I can explain this so that it's easily understandable, because I don't know if what I'm trying to say is actually coming through. Sometimes things come through in my mind and it's like a light bulb moment, but they're tough to communicate so that people understand them. But let's back up, okay? Paul very clearly in Romans 11 is saying that individuals in the nations, or the fullness of the nations, had to come in so that all Israel could be saved. Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 is saying that when one Israelite turns to the Lord, the veil is lifted away. So do you see how there's this mission that Paul is speaking about in both places? In 2 Corinthians chapter 3, there is no confusion. Paul is flat out locked in, focused on Israel being saved. He's flat out locked in, speaking of Israel's blindness, and he's talking about when one Israelite turns to the Lord, the blindness is removed. In Romans 11, he talks about when the fullness of the nations comes in, all Israel will be saved. But remember now, he's talking about the blindness as well in Romans 11. So I guess my point here is that these are the same things that he's saying here. Okay, he's saying the fullness of the nations coming in will result in all Israel being saved. So every time one of those Israelites from 2 Corinthians chapter 3 turns to the Lord and the blindness is removed, it contributes to the Romans 11 fullness of the nations coming in. Right? Because the fullness of the nations coming in had to happen in order for all Israel to be saved. So every time an Israelite turned to the Lord, the blindness was removed. Right? And Paul says in Romans 11 that blindness in part had happened to Israel until when? Until they all came in. You get, I hope you understand what I'm getting at here. And maybe if you don't, you can ask a question in the comments or we can talk about it a little bit more. But again, every time one Israelite turned to the Lord, the blindness was removed, says Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. In Romans 11, Paul said that a partial blinding had come upon Israel until the fullness of the nations had come in. So 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and Romans 11, 25 and forward is pretty much the same thing. They're both talking about blindness upon Israel, and they're both talking about that blindness eventually being removed, or the process of Israel's blindness being removed. Okay, in 2 Corinthians 3, Paul is very clear. He's basically puts it right out there and says, when one Israelite turns to the Lord, the blindness is lifted. And again, that is the exact same thing as Romans 11, when it says, blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the nations has come in. And what's interesting is, remember now, Paul is writing to the Corinthians. This is a nation. This is a Gentile, if you will, a Gentile region. Right? And he's writing to them, and he's basically saying that when one Israelite turns to the Lord, the veil is lifted, blindness is removed. So in essence here, what's happening is that Romans 11 prediction that when the fullness of the nations comes in, all Israel would be saved, that's being fulfilled and completed by way of 2 Corinthians chapter 3, because Paul is writing to those in Corinth, the ones who had been saved, the ones who were being added, the ones who blindness was being lifted from. And they're the nations, right? They're the fullness of the nations. They're the ones in Corinth are contributing to Paul's fullness of the nations coming in. And of course we know from 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 1, where Paul says all of our fathers passed through the Red Sea and were baptized into Moses. Of course we know who that is. That's Israel. He's writing to the children of Israel in Corinth. So 2 Corinthians 3 is no different. He's still writing to the children of Israel in Corinth. And he's telling them that when one of them turns to the Lord, the veil is lifted away further. Same exact thing that Romans 11 says. Blindness has happened to Israel until you all come in. Blindness has happened to Israel until the fullness of all of you in the nations has come in. Until you all in the nations have turned to the Lord. And the veil is lifted away in full. So I don't know if that made as much sense to you as it did to me. To me, I think this is a groundbreaking discovery because 2 Corinthians 3 proves without any shadow of any doubt, not that there was any doubt about Romans 11, but I know people like to use it as a, place of confusion. To me, Romans 11 is one of the clearest portions in all of Scripture, especially when you read it in its proper rendering, the English Standard Version, which gets it right. When it says, and in this way, all Israel will be saved. In what way? In the fullness of the nations coming in. That's how all Israel eventually got saved, is because they were all being gathered in from the nations. Revelation 5, you have called us from every nation, tribe, tongue, and kindred. So folks, 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 12 to 16 is an interpretive passage to better understand Romans chapter 11, verses 25 to 27. And what it clearly proves, without any shadow of any doubt, is that when an Israelite turned to the Lord, the blindness was removed even further. Therefore, proving that Romans 11, fullness of the nations, was just that. It was Israelites out in the nations turning to the Lord, contributing to the blindness being removed. Because remember, Paul had said the blindness in part had happened to Israel until they had all come in. Anyways, folks, that's all I got for you today. I hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned tomorrow. I have another one on the fullness of the nations that I think you're really going to enjoy to hammer this home even further. If you liked it, give it a like. If not, take a hike, and we'll catch you on that flip side. Bye-bye, everyone.